Douglas Roberts stares at the ceremonial ice cave entrance, realizing too late that his Reman host family intends to feed him to the legendary glacial behemoth. The crystalline aliens tower over him, their silicon-based forms refracting the pale light of Ramana's twin moons. At 17, the human exchange student had expected his participation in the Galactic Youth Science program to challenge him, but not like this. The bitter wind whips through his thermal suit as his host family guides him toward the cave mouth. Their faceted forms betray no emotion, but their intentions are clear. The cave yawns before him, a perfect trap for the behemoth's next meal. Douglas draws on his years growing up in northern Alaska, analyzing the ice formations. The temperature here drops well below anything on Earth, but the physics remains the same. A slight movement catches his eye. In the shadows, a younger Reman Gia, his host family's daughter, discreetly passes him a data crystal. Her crystalline form vibrates in a pattern he recognizes as fear. The crystal contains vital information: the behemoth's hunting patterns, its reliance on thermal signatures, its biological weaknesses. She opposes the Reman High Council's xenophobic plan to eliminate human participants from the program, one accident at a time. The push comes suddenly. Douglas stumbles into the cave, the entrance sealing behind him with a decisive crack. The ice tunnels stretch in every direction, a labyrinth where the behemoth hunts its prey. In the distance, he feels vibrations growing stronger the creature approaches. The observation chamber of the Reman High Council sits somewhere above, watching, waiting for another successful elimination of a human student. But Douglas isn't planning to become prey. His mind races through the physics equations he learned in the program, combining them with his practical knowledge of ice and cold. He begins gathering materials, crystalline formations from the cave walls, components stripped from his thermal suit. Each piece will serve as a heat-generating decoy, creating multiple thermal signatures to confuse the predator. The vibrations intensify. Somewhere in the darkness, the glacial behemoth moves closer, tracking heat signatures through the ice. The Reman High Council watches from above, certain of their scheme's success. They don't realize that their perfect trap contains the seeds of their own exposure. Douglas sets his first decoy, a smile playing across his face. The Council's plan to feed a human boy to the ice monster is about to backfire spectacularly. His earth science education and survival skills have prepared him for this moment. As he works, Douglas knows that surviving isn't enough. He needs to expose this murderous scheme to the Galactic Federation. The behemoth's hunting patterns, revealed in Gia's data, give him the advantage he needs. In the freezing darkness, he prepares to turn the tables on both the monster and its masters. Douglas pressed the first decoy against the ice wall, adjusting its thermal output. The crystalline formations he'd gathered from the cave walls amplified the heat signature, creating a pattern that mimicked human movement. He worked swiftly, fingers moving with precision despite the biting cold that penetrated his partially dismantled thermal suit. The vibrations through the ice intensified. Each tremor carried distinctive patterns, the behemoth's movements translated through the crystalline structure of the cavern. Douglas placed a second decoy 20 meters away, then a third, creating a triangulated pattern. The bioluminescent crystals he discovered in the darker recesses of the cave pulsed with a faint blue glow, providing just enough light to work by. Above, in the observation chamber, Gia's crystalline form vibrated with tension as she monitored Douglas's movements through the Reman scanning equipment. Her appendages moved across the control surface, recording every detail. Council member Crix loomed behind her, his jagged form casting fractured shadows across the monitoring station. "Adjust the environmental controls," Crix commanded the technicians. "Drop the temperature in Section 4. Force him toward the main chamber." Douglas felt the temperature shift, a sudden plunge that would have been lethal without his remaining thermal protection. He recognized the pattern they were trying to hedge him in. Instead of fighting it, he used their manipulation to his advantage, placing his next decoy exactly where they thought they were forcing him to go. The behemoth's approach changed. The vibrations split into distinct patterns that converged on his network of decoys. The creature's massive form appeared briefly in the dim light, a serpentine body of living ice, thermal sensing organs pulsing along its crystalline length. It moved with surprising grace for its size, following the heat signatures exactly as Gia's data had predicted. Douglas pressed himself against a narrow ice shelf, using the natural formations to mask his body heat. His fingers worked quickly, connecting the final components stripped from his suit to trigger a controlled fracture in the ice structure. The physics was simple: controlled thermal expansion in precise locations would create predictable stress patterns. In the observation chamber, Crix's crystalline form shifted with increasing agitation. "Release the second behemoth," he ordered. "Counselor," Elder Voss interrupted, his ancient form refracting light in complex patterns. "That exceeds our established protocols." "Do it." Gia's hands moved faster across her console, encrypting data packets and transmitting them through secured channels to Lynn. Each transmission contained damning evidence timestamps, thermal readings, command protocols that proved the Council's direct involvement in multiple accidents. The ice beneath Douglas's feet trembled with new vibrations different from the first, a second rhythm that spoke of another massive creature moving through the tunnels. He detected the change immediately, noting how the overlapping patterns created resonance points in the ice structure. The entire cavern network groaned under the strain. His mind raced through calculations: wave propagation, structural stress points, thermal vectors. The maintenance shaft Gia had indicated in her data crystal waited 20 meters above, partially concealed behind a sheet of thin ice. It represented both escape and evidence, but reaching it meant crossing the intersection where both behemoths would likely meet. Douglas activated his remaining decoys in sequence, creating a complex pattern of heat signatures that drew both creatures toward the widest part of the tunnel system. The ice continued to groan, small cracks spreading through the walls as the behemoth's movements created competing vibration patterns. A sheet of ice crashed down nearby, missing him by centimeters. The entire network was becoming unstable. Through the crystalline walls, he caught glimpses of movement, massive shapes converging on his position, drawn by the elaborate web of thermal signatures he'd created. The next few minutes would determine not only his survival, but the safety of the entire Remand settlement above. He began his climb toward the maintenance shaft, each movement precisely calculated. The behemoths below followed his trail of decoys, their massive forms creating seismic waves that threatened to shake the cavern apart. Time was running out, but Douglas allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes the best way to spring a trap was to make it collapse entirely. Douglas pulled himself into the maintenance shaft just as the first tremor shook loose a cascade of ice crystals. The narrow service tunnel provided minimal protection from the dropping temperature, but its metal walls offered stable handholds. Through the transparent ice panels, he watched his network of decoys continue to draw the behemoth's attention. A burst of static emerged from a communications panel. "Douglas." Gia's crystalline voice vibrated through the speaker. "The second behemoth's thermal tracking organs are more sensitive than the first. Your decoys won't hold it for long." "Send me the structural data," Douglas responded, stripping another heating element from his suit sleeve. The metal felt brittle in his hands, frost already forming along its edges. The panel displayed a three-dimensional map of the cave system. Red indicators pulsed at key stress points, with a particularly dense cluster beneath the observation chamber. The behemoth's movements had created a network of spreading fractures. In the chamber above, Elder Voss's crystalline form shifted as he accessed the facility's secure archives. data streams reflected off his faceted surface, each one revealing another suspicious death. "Counselor Crix," he announced, "I am recording multiple violations of Federation safety protocols under your authorization." Crix's jagged form twisted toward the security controls. The humans adapt too quickly. Their presence threatens Reman's stability. His appendages moved across the environmental console. Better to eliminate this problem now. Warning lights flashed across the maintenance tunnel's displays. Douglas felt the temperature plummet as supercooled air flooded the cave system. The heating elements in his hands grew increasingly unstable, their power cells straining against the cold. The first behemoth slammed against the ice wall, its massive crystalline body visible through the translucent barrier. Its thermal sensing organs pulsed with confusion as Douglas's decoys created conflicting heat signatures. The second creature emerged from a lower tunnel, its more refined sensory structures already beginning to distinguish the artificial patterns. "Federation peacekeepers are responding," Gia transmitted. "Captain Jackson's ship is in position, but they can't risk a direct extraction." Douglas checked his remaining components. 5 heating elements, 3 power cells, and a section of thermal cabling. The mathematics of heat distribution and structural stress played out in his mind as he plotted the precise positions needed. Through the ice, he watched Council Member Crix attempt to bypass the chamber's security protocols. The observation room's occupants gathered near the sealed exits, their crystalline forms reflecting the increasing panic. Elder Voss continued transmitting evidence files even as the chamber's support structures groaned under the spreading fractures. The first behemoth struck again, this time targeting one of the primary support columns. Douglas activated his remaining thermal components in sequence, creating a calculated pattern of heat signatures that drew both creatures away from the weakening chamber supports. The supercooled air threatened to overwhelm his devices, but the timing had to be precise. "Gia, can you redirect power to the eastern tunnel's thermal regulators?" "Yes, but it will overload that entire section." "Perfect. On my mark." Douglas positioned his final heating element against a precise point in the ice structure, where the competing vibration patterns created a resonance node. The behemoths followed his trail of heat signatures, their massive bodies creating seismic waves that amplified the structural weaknesses. In the observation chamber, Crix lunged for the master environmental controls. "I will not allow," Elder Voss's crystalline form intercepted him, their faceted surfaces grinding together. "Enough! Your xenophobia endangers us all." Douglas activated his final sequence. Now Gia, the eastern tunnel's thermal system surged. Ice cracked in a controlled pattern, directing the cave's collapse away from the observation chamber while maintaining a single stable evacuation route. The behemoths, overwhelmed by the sudden temperature shifts, retreated into the deeper caverns. Above, Federation peacekeepers began cutting through the chamber's outer seal. Captain Jackson's voice crackled through the facility's communications system. "Hold position. Extraction team incoming." But the rescue would have to wait. The temperature continued to drop, and Douglas still needed to navigate the collapsing tunnel system to reach the evacuation point. Through the ice walls, he caught glimpses of crystalline movements, both behemoths circling back, drawn by his body's remaining heat signature. The race wasn't over yet. Douglas pressed against the maintenance shaft's wall as another tremor shook the tunnels. Through the ice, he tracked the behemoth's converging paths. The creature's massive forms cast shifting shadows in the dim light, their crystalline bodies refracting what little illumination remained. His fingers moved across the old maintenance panel, accessing long-dormant systems. The shaft's decommissioned heating elements still held residual power, not enough for warmth, but sufficient for his needs. He reprogrammed them in sequence, creating subtle heat signatures that mimicked the cave's natural thermal vents. "Captain Jackson to Douglas," his communicator crackled. "Our sensors are mapping the fracture patterns. The ice structure's becoming critically unstable." "Confirmed," Douglas responded, connecting another salvaged component. "I need 3 minutes to complete this sequence." On the Vigilance Bridge, Dr. Wilson studied the spreading network of cracks displayed on his console. "Captain, the destabilization is accelerating. We're detecting movement in the surrounding ice sheet." Jackson ordered emergency stability probes deployed to the surface, knowing they would only slow the inevitable cascade. In the observation chamber, Elder Voss's crystalline form vibrated as he interfaced with the environmental controls. His emergency codes provided limited access enough to decelerate the temperature drop, but not halt it. Behind him, Crix lunged toward the console. "You'll doom us all." Crix's jagged appendages reached for Voss, but other council members intercepted him, their crystalline bodies grinding together as they restrained their former leader. Douglas's communicator lit up with new data from Gia. The maintenance shaft sensors revealed a pattern in the behemoth's movements. Their hunting created specific vibration frequencies that resonated through the ice structure. He analyzed the numbers, recognizing their significance. The creatures were generating waves similar to those that could shatter glass or, in this case, reshape ice. He placed his remaining thermal components at precise intervals, each position calculated to amplify these resonance points. The behemoths followed his manufactured heat trail, their massive bodies sliding through the tunnels with predatory grace. Their thermal sensing organs pulsed as they detected the false safe zone he'd created. Ice cracked overhead. Douglas activated the first sequence of repurposed heating elements. The behemoths changed course, drawn by the subtle temperature gradients. Their movements matched his predictions exactly, converging on the trap point he'd selected. "Douglas," Gia transmitted, "chamber temperature approaching critical threshold for your remaining equipment." He checked his calculations one final time. The behemoths entered the target zone, their bodies creating overlapping vibration patterns that shook the surrounding ice. Douglas triggered his remaining thermal components in rapid succession. Each detonation amplified the creature's resonance frequency. Ice fractured in controlled patterns. Walls collapsed inward, forming steep barriers that channeled the behemoths exactly where he intended. The creatures thrashed as new ice walls rose around them, their struggles only accelerating the formation of their crystalline prison. The final thermal component failed as the temperature plunged below its operational threshold. Douglas felt the cold bite through his remaining layers. His breath frosted instantly in the super-chilled air. The trapped behemoth's movements sent tremors through the maintenance shaft, threatening to trigger secondary collapses. "Extraction teams in position," Jackson transmitted. "But we're detecting critical stress patterns throughout the ice sheet. You have 7 minutes before total structural failure." Douglas pulled himself up through the shaft, every movement measured to conserve body heat. Ice groaned around him as he navigated toward the observation chamber. His training in Alaska's harshest conditions had prepared him for this cold, but even that experience paled against the artificial winter Crix had created. Through the crystalline walls, he watched the council members guide Elder Voss toward the chamber's exit point. Federation peacekeepers had cut through the outer seal, creating a narrow escape route, but reaching it meant crossing sections of ice already weakened by the spreading fractures. The behemoths slammed against their prison walls, each impact sending new cracks racing through the surrounding tunnels. Douglas forced his increasingly stiff fingers to grip the maintenance shaft's handholds, fighting the lethargy that accompanied severe cold exposure. The chamber's exit point waited above, beyond a section of ice that grew more unstable with each passing second. His communicator displayed new sensor data from the Vigilant, a cascade of fractures spreading through the ice sheet, threatening to transform the entire region into a frozen avalanche. The stability probe slowed the progression, but the countdown to total collapse continued unabated. Douglas reached for the next handhold, ice crystals forming on his exposed skin. The observation chamber waited just ahead, but the final approach would test every lesson learned from Earth's harshest environments. Behind him, the behemoth's prison held firm, but their struggles sent waves of destruction rippling through the weakening ice structure. Douglas focused his mind against another violent shiver. His fingers, numb from the biting cold, scraped against the maintenance shaft's insulated panels. Training kicked in, he began flexing each muscle group systematically, generating precious body heat while conserving energy. "Douglas, I've found something," Gia transmitted. "Accessing facility schematics. There's a repair drone tunnel leading directly to the observation chamber." The tunnel schematic appeared on his communicator display. The passage measured barely 60 centimeters in diameter, too narrow for Reman anatomy, but just wide enough for his human frame. "Structural integrity at 28%, Captain Jackson's voice crackled through. "We're deploying gravity anchors to stabilize the ice sheet." Through the crystalline walls, Douglas watched Federation emergency teams setting up perimeter positions. Their lights swept across the ice surface, revealing an expanding web of fractures. His communicator pinged with new alerts, multiple Reman vessels approaching the sector. The maintenance tunnel entrance waited ahead, sealed behind a thick layer of frost. Douglas pressed his palm against the frozen control panel, his mind racing through Arctic survival protocols. The mineral deposits in the cave walls caught his attention specifically, their potential for exothermic reaction. He scraped a handful of crystalline fragments from different sections, combining them with precise pressure. Heat bloomed between his palms. The entrance seal hissed, ice melting away from its edges. "Warning," Gia announced. "Behemoth containment compromised. Creatures moving toward facility power core." The tunnel's cramped interior pressed against Douglas's shoulders as he crawled forward. Each movement sent vibrations through the ice structure. Above, the observation chamber's reinforced windows developed spiderweb patterns of cracks. His communicator displayed the gravity anchor positioning data. "Captain, adjust anchor 315 degrees port. The ice sheet's stress patterns indicate a weakness in that sector." Elder Voss's voice cut through the facility's emergency channel. Evidence files uploaded to secure Federation servers. Council member Crix's actions are now documented. A crash echoed through the transmission. "Security systems compromised. Crix has accessed defense protocols." Douglas reached a junction in the maintenance tunnel. The power core's status indicators flashed red as the behemoth's massive forms approached its outer chambers. Their crystalline bodies cast refracting shadows through the ice walls. "Temperature dropping in Section 7, Gia reported. "Environmental systems failing." The observation chamber's support structures groaned. Douglas watched through sensor feeds as Crix fought against his fellow council members, his jagged appendages striking at the chamber's control systems. Emergency lockdown protocols activated, sealing the remaining exits. Douglas's fingers trembled as he rerouted power through the maintenance systems. The gravity anchors pulsed, their energy fields pushing against the destabilizing ice sheet. He calculated each adjustment, balancing the forces to prevent a catastrophic collapse. The behemoth's thermal sensing organs flared as they detected the power core's heat signature. Their massive bodies pressed against the facility's outer walls, creating new fracture patterns that propagated through the ice structure. "Douglas," Captain Jackson transmitted, "Reman military vessels entering weapons range. Time is critical." The maintenance tunnel ended at a narrow access panel. Through it, Douglas saw the observation chamber tilting precariously as its support beams buckled. Elder Voss worked at the central console, transmitting data even as the chamber's systems failed around him. Ice cracked beneath Douglas's position. The behemoths moved closer to the power core, their hunting instincts focused entirely on its thermal signature. His sensor display showed their ice prison collapsing, the carefully constructed canyon walls giving way under their renewed assault. The gravity anchor's energy fields fluctuated as Douglas adjusted their positioning. Each modification required precise timing to prevent the ice sheet from splitting apart. Through the chamber's cracking windows, he watched Federation emergency teams deploying additional stability probes. His body temperature dropped dangerously low as he reached for the access panel's manual release. The metal stuck to his exposed skin, frozen layers peeling away as he activated the emergency override. Above, the observation chamber's remaining structural supports began to fail. The panel opened with a crack of breaking ice. Douglas pulled himself toward the chamber's tilting floor, his muscles protesting against the extreme cold. The behemoth's movement sent tremors through the facility's foundation, and the power core's containment readings edged toward critical levels. Douglas pulled himself through the access panel as another tremor rocked the facility. The observation chamber's floor tilted at a steep angle, forcing him to brace against a support beam. His fingers left frost patterns on the metal surface where they touched. The council members clustered near the chamber's upper section, their crystalline forms grinding against each other as they struggled to restrain cricks. Each impact from the behemoths below increased the chamber's tilt. Spiderweb cracks spread across the reinforced windows. Douglas crawled toward the nearest maintenance panel, his muscles protesting every movement. The display flickered as his shaking fingers accessed the environmental controls. "GIA, route auxiliary power to thermal regulators," he transmitted, teeth chattering. "Need precise control of the temperature gradient." The AI responded instantly, feeding power to the systems. Douglas manipulated the controls, creating carefully calculated heat patterns that matched the window's stress points. The spreading cracks slowed as the thermal balance stabilized the crystalline structure. "Federation vessel, withdraw immediately." A new voice cut through the communication channels. "This is Admiral Krell of the Reman Defense Force. We are assuming control under Planetary Security Directive 7. Captain Jackson's response crackled through Douglas's communicator. "Negative, Admiral. We have Federation citizens at risk and evidence of criminal conspiracy. The Vigilant maintains position." The chamber shuddered as massive forms moved beneath the floor. The behemoth's thermal sensing organs pulsed visibly through gaps in the ice, drawn by the heat signatures from Douglas's window stabilization effort. Elder Voss separated from the group restraining cricks. His crystalline body caught the emergency lights as he moved toward Douglas's position. "Human, your actions here." He pressed his appendage against a control surface. "Full system access granted. Save what you can." Douglas's display expanded with new options. He transmitted coordinates to the Vigilant, marking critical points in the ice sheet structure. "Captain, gravity anchors need precise placement at these locations. The resonance patterns will stabilize the entire sheet." Ice cracked below as the behemoths attacked the facility's support structures. Their coordinated strikes sent synchronized vibrations through the chamber. Douglas recognized the pattern similar to wolf packs he'd studied in Alaska, using combined attacks to weaken prey barriers. He accessed the maintenance systems, diverting power from inactive sections to reinforce failing structural supports. His fingers moved through emergency protocols, overriding bulkhead controls to create an evacuation route toward the secondary landing bay. Crix's crystalline form flashed as he activated a hidden beacon. The chamber's sensors detected multiple Reman vessels beginning atmospheric entry, weapons systems active. "Warning," Gia announced. "Power core containment field showing signs of instability. Breach imminent at current deterioration rate." Douglas checked the sensor readings. The behemoth's attacks had compromised crucial power conduits. The core's containment field fluctuated dangerously, its energy signature becoming erratic. A breach would vaporize everyone inside the facility and destroy all evidence of the Council's crimes. The maintenance tunnel behind him collapsed with a grinding crash. Douglas accessed the facility's structural blueprints, plotting an alternate evacuation route. Council members moved toward Emergency Shaft 3. Federation teams are staging at the secondary landing bay. Crick struck out at his captors, his jagged appendages scraping against their crystalline forms. The chamber's tilt increased as the behemoth's synchronized attacks intensified. Douglas braced himself against the control panel, fighting waves of cold-induced lethargy. "Power core breach in 6 minutes," Gia reported. Behemoth attack patterns show increasing coordination. Chamber structural integrity at 17%. Douglas split the facility's displays between evacuation routes and power core diagnostics. Every muscle screamed for rest, but his Arctic survival training kept him focused. He transmitted new data to the Vigilant, adjusting gravity anchor positions as the ice sheet's stress patterns evolved. The council members began moving toward the emergency shaft, Elder Voss in the lead. Crick's earlier actions had sealed several bulkheads along their route. Douglas's fingers flew across the controls, bypassing security protocols to open alternate pathways. Above, Federation and remand vessels maneuvered for position. Douglas coordinated with emergency teams through the facility's communications grid, tracking multiple crisis points simultaneously. The chamber's stabilized windows creaked as the behemoth launched another coordinated strike. Time compressed into a series of critical decisions. Douglas monitored power core readings while guiding the Council's evacuation, each moment bringing new challenges. The facility groaned around them, ice and metal straining against forces that threatened to tear it apart. Douglas's fingers flew across the control interface as a solution crystallized in his mind. He accessed the facility's drone control systems, redistributing their thermal signatures to create a network of heat barriers. Gia, remap maintenance drone pathways. Configure thermal output to match behemoth territorial markers. His voice rasped from the cold as he input commands. The drones responded instantly, their movements creating precisely calculated heat patterns through the facility's lower levels. The behemoth's thermal sensing organs pulsed in response. Their coordinated attacks faltered as the drones' heat signatures disrupted their pack dynamics. Douglas recognized the behavior patterns similar to wolf pack responses to artificial scent markers he'd studied during Arctic research missions. "Gravity anchors in position," Captain Jackson transmitted, "ready for synchronized activation." Douglas checked the ice sheet stress patterns one final time. "Activate on my mark. Now." The anchors hummed to life. Energy fields pulsed through the ice structure, stabilizing critical stress points. Warning indicators flashed across his display as the power surge overloaded auxiliary systems. "Council members, proceed to evacuation route Beta," he transmitted, bypassing failed communication relays. "Federation teams are advancing to secure your position." Elder Voss led the group toward the emergency shaft. Their crystalline forms scraped against the tilted chamber floor as they moved. A proximity alert flashed. Crick had broken free during the power surge, sealing himself inside the facility's communication center. "Admiral Krell," Crick's voice cut through the emergency channel, "the humans are attempting to seize control of the facility. Their gravity anchors are compromising our defensive systems." Douglas's display showed multiple remand vessels beginning their descent, weapons charging. He divided his attention between monitoring the evacuation route and analyzing the behemoth's response to the drone network. Their movement patterns triggered a recognition sequence in his mind too coordinated, too precise for natural creatures. Gia, access facility research archives. Search for behemoth origin data. The AI's response came instantly. Accessing. Restricted files located. behemoths identified as engineered organisms. Original designation, Planetary Defense Initiative, Phase 3. Douglas's fingers moved faster as he processed the information. He reconfigured the maintenance drone's thermal outputs to match archived military command frequencies. The behemoth's attack ceased as ancient programming activated within their crystalline bodies. The chamber shuddered as Admiral Krell's ships established firing positions. Douglas watched through external cameras as the Vigilant moved to intercept, its shields powering up. "Admiral," Elder Voss transmitted. "Authentication code sequence, Voss Prime 73. Council Member Crix has committed acts of treason against both our peoples. Transmitting evidence now." Douglas monitored the power core's containment field as it fluctuated dangerously. The gravity anchor's energy reserves dropped steadily, their stabilizing effect on the ice sheet beginning to weaken. He calculated remaining time 17 minutes before complete anchor failure. Crix's voice snarled through the facility's speakers. "If I can't protect our world from human contamination, I'll ensure none of you survive to spread their influence." Power surged through the core's systems as he initiated emergency overload procedures. The maintenance drone's thermal network flickered as power fluctuations disrupted their output. Douglas watched the behemoth's thermal organs pulse erratically, their ancient programming conflicting with hunting instincts. He rerouted emergency power to critical drone nodes, maintaining the command signal pattern. "Warning," Gia announced. "Core containment field at 12%. Complete failure imminent." Ice cracked beneath the observation chamber as the gravity anchor's field strength decreased. Douglas's vision blurred from hypothermia, but his fingers continued moving across the control interface. He adjusted drone positions, compensating for failed units while maintaining the precise thermal patterns needed to control the behemoths. "Federation teams have secured the evacuation route," Captain Jackson reported. "Council members approaching secondary landing bay." Through the chamber's stabilized windows, Douglas watched Admiral Krell's ships holding position, their weapons powered but inactive as they processed Elder Voss's evidence transmission. The Vigilant maintained its defensive stance, shield harmonics matching the reman vessel's targeting frequencies. The power core's containment field fluctuated wildly as Crix accessed deeper system controls. Douglas tracked the facility's failing systems, calculating power requirements against remaining resources. The gravity anchor's energy reserves continued dropping, each minute bringing the ice sheet closer to catastrophic collapse. His display showed the behemoths responding to thermal commands, their movements now controlled but growing increasingly unstable as power fluctuations affected the drone network. The observation chamber's reinforced windows creaked under mounting pressure as the facility's structural supports continued to fail. Douglas accessed the facility's primary maintenance interface, his frost-numbed fingers tapping commands into the control panel. The thermal network's output patterns shifted as he initiated a carefully calculated feedback loop, amplifying the ancient reman command frequencies through the drone array. The behemoth's thermal organs pulsed in response, their massive crystalline bodies moving with mechanical precision as ancestral programming activated. Douglas watched through the facility's sensors as the creatures repositioned themselves around the foundation pillars, their bulk providing counterpressure against the structural strain. "Gia, track Crix's location," he transmitted, pulling himself away from the control panel. The AI's response highlighted a pathway through his display. Crix was moving toward the power core's primary control room. Douglas grabbed his survival pack, checking his ice-climbing gear as he moved toward the maintenance access tunnel. The narrow passage barely accommodated his frame as he navigated through the facility's infrastructure. Cold air burned his lungs with each breath, but the confined space allowed him to move faster than Crix could through the main corridors. The power core's status indicators flashed red as Douglas emerged into the control room. Crick stood at the main console, his crystalline appendages interfacing with the overload controls. The Reman's larger form blocked the primary access point, but his focus on the console left him unaware of Douglas's entrance through the maintenance shaft. Douglas unclipped his ice axe, the metal scraping softly against his belt. Crix turned at the sound, his crystalline body refracting emergency lights as he struck out with jagged limbs. Douglas ducked under the attack, years of cold weather training guiding his movements despite his body's protests. The cramped control room worked to Douglas's advantage. Crix's larger form couldn't maneuver effectively between the consoles, while Douglas slipped through the gaps. He struck with precise movements, using his ice axe to deflect Crix's crystalline appendages away from critical systems. Crix lunged forward, overextending himself. Douglas seized the opening, driving his shoulder into the Reman's midsection. They crashed into the auxiliary control panel, warning klaxons blaring as systems sparked around them. Douglas pulled his climbing rope free, wrapping it around Crix's thrashing limbs while avoiding their sharp edges. "You cannot stop what's coming," Crix snarled as Douglas secured the final knot, using his climbing carabiners to reinforce the restraints. Douglas ignored him, moving to the core control interface. His fingers flew across the commands, rerouting power through emergency subsystems. The containment field's fluctuations steadied as he established new energy pathways. "Gia, prepare full data upload to Federation and Remand vessels," he transmitted, accessing the communication array. "Include all sensor logs and security footage." The evidence streamed outward, thermal imaging showing the behemoth's engineered nature, security feeds revealing Crix's sabotage attempts, and environmental data proving Douglas's ethical choices throughout the crisis. Above, Admiral Krell's ships powered down their weapons as the transmission arrived. "Federation teams entering through secondary landing bay," Captain Jackson reported. Moving to secure the facility. Douglas monitored the behemoths through thermal imaging as he guided Elder Voss's group along the evacuation route. The creatures maintained their defensive positions, their ancient programming now serving to protect rather than destroy. The gravity anchors hummed steadily, their energy field stabilizing the ice sheet structure. Douglas accessed the facility's geological sensors, confirming the avalanche threat had subsided. He turned his attention to the behemoth control interface, reprogramming their behavioral parameters one final time. The creatures responded to his commands, their massive forms moving in precise formation toward a newly formed ice canyon. Douglas tracked their progress through the thermal imaging network, noting how their movement patterns already began adapting to the natural terrain features. "Douglas," Elder Voss's voice came through the comm system. "The Council is safely aboard Federation vessels. Admiral Krell requests your presence for debrief." Before responding, Douglas checked the power core's status one final time. The containment field held steady, emergency systems functioning within normal parameters. He looked at Crix, still bound by climbing gear and now surrounded by Federation security officers. "Acknowledged," Douglas transmitted, shutting down his control interface. Heading to secondary landing bay. His muscles protested as he stood, the full weight of his exhaustion finally settling in. But the facility stood secure around him, its systems stabilized and its secrets revealed. The behemoth's thermal signatures pulsed steadily on his final sensor check, their engineered bodies finding purpose in their new home. Above, Federation and Remand ships maintained position in the clearing skis, their combined presence marking the beginning of a transformed relationship between their peoples. Douglas began the long walk to the landing bay, Gia's presence accompanying him through the facility's systems. Through the reinforced windows, he watched the behemoth's distant forms disappearing into the ice canyon, their thermal signatures fading into the natural patterns of their chosen territory.